Hi, today we're going to look at the visions of Cornelius and Peter. As we start, I want to ask you a question. What does a Christian look like? I know that's kind of a silly question, but we all probably have some preconceived ideas of what a Christian should and should not look like. For me, it's easier to picture a Christian as someone who's a clean-cut individual, someone who dresses conservatively, wears a smile on his face. It's a little harder for me to picture a Christian as someone who is heavily tatted, has numerous skin piercings, whose hair is dyed a neon green, and who wears exclusively leather. The truth is, it's easier to picture Christians as someone like me, someone like you. We like to picture people like us as Christians. But we all need to be challenged outside of our comfort zone to realize that God is open to all people. All people are welcome to Christ. And it's not what's on the outside that counts. It's what's on the inside. And God knows the heart. So those are some lessons that Peter was going to learn in a vision. And his vision would lead him to a meeting with Cornelius, a Gentile man, and a person very different from Peter. We see the story in Acts 10. At Caesarea there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion in what was known as the Italian regiment. He and all his family were devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. One day at about 3 p.m, he had a vision. He distinctly saw an angel of God who came to him and said, "Cornelius." Cornelius stared at him in fear. "What is it, Lord?" he asked. The angel answered, "Your prayers and gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God. Now send men to Joppa and bring back a man named Simon, who is called Peter. He is staying with Simon the tanner, whose house is by the sea." When the angel who spoke to him had gone, Cornelius called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier who was one of his attendants. He told them everything that had happened and sent them to Joppa. For both the visions of Cornelius and Peter, we're going to break them down into questions of where, who, when, and what. So we begin with Cornelius's vision, and we begin with that question of where. Well, this took place in Caesarea. And Caesarea was a large city on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, about 30 miles north of Joppa. And we recall that Peter is staying at Joppa with Simon the tanner there. Unlike Lydda and Joppa, which were mainly inhabited by Jews, Caesarea was a Hellenistic-style city populated primarily by Gentiles. It was originally a small town named Strato's Tower, but it was renamed and rebuilt by Herod the Great in honor of Augustus Caesar, and so it got the name Caesarea. As we know, Herod the Great had some pretty significant personality flaws. However, his building programs were quite impressive. One of the greatest building achievements that he had was the building of the temple in Jerusalem. And when he set his mind to build a temple for the Jews, he wanted to be far superior to Solomon's temple. It was to be a temple that would elicit awe from anyone who would enter it. The building of the temple literally took decades to complete. So we can see from that structure just what great pride he takes in his building projects. And Caesarea is also a big example of that. Caesarea was complete with a man-made harbor, a theater, an amphitheater, a hippodrome, and a temple dedicated to Caesar. Today we might call Herod's Caesarea project an urban renewal project. He took an insignificant piece of land and rebuilt it into something beautiful with magnificent buildings, with entertainment venues. It was like a resort destination. Now we come to the question of who, and the who here is Cornelius. And Cornelius was a Gentile. He was also a centurion, and a centurion is a Roman officer who is in charge of 100 soldiers. A Roman legion contained about 6,000 men, and legions were divided then into 10 regiments. Each regiment had about 600 men, and so a centurion would lead about 100 of those men in a regiment. And regiments were given names, such as the Augustan Regiment or the Imperial Regiment. And the regiment that Cornelius was in charge of was called the Italian Regiment. Cornelius was a God-fearing man. He's about as religious as you could get without actually being a Christian. He rejected all the Roman gods and practices in favor of worshiping the one true God that the Jews worshipped. And he prayed at the regular Jewish times of prayer. He gave to people in need. But because he was an uncircumcised Gentile, he could never be a full member of the Jewish faith. So his heart was open to God, but the Jewish rituals and customs and laws kind of put up a barrier that he couldn't get through. And beyond that, he was not yet introduced to Jesus Christ. So he was a God-fearing man, but not yet a Christian. But God took notice of Cornelius, his prayers, and his gifts to the poor. God saw those, and God was pleased with that. We look at the question of when. This took place at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. There were 3 traditional Jewish times of prayer. One took place in the morning, one took place in the afternoon about 3 o'clock, one took place in the evening. And so he's praying at that afternoon prayer at 3 o'clock. So he's praying, and during that afternoon prayer, God, through that prayer, gave him a vision to give a special message to him. So that leads us to the final question with Cornelius. And what was it? Well, it was a vision. He had a vision. In that vision, God used an angel to call Cornelius by name. Kind of reminds us just how personal God is with all of us, that God knows us by name, and God calls us by name. The angel told Cornelius, there was a man named Peter living in the city of Joppa. He told Cornelius exactly where he would be staying. He would be staying at Simon the tanner's house by the sea. Now, Joppa was a large town, but knowing Simon's profession and that his house was near the sea would make it a lot easier to find him. Often people of the same trade would live in the same district. So tanners would also kind of live close to a water source, and that's why he would live by the sea. So the men that Cornelius would send to find Peter would know exactly the district where Simon lived. He's living with the other tanners in that tanner district. They would then ask the locals exactly which house in that district belonged to Simon. And in the days before a GPS and before Google Maps, that's how it was done. Well, the angel did not tell Cornelius exactly who Peter was or why he was to bring him to Caesarea. But Cornelius did not argue. As a good soldier, he obeyed. He sent a couple of his most trusted men to find Peter in Joppa. And we pick up the story now in verse 9. About noon the following day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat. And while the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw heaven open and something like a large sheet being let down to earth by its 4 corners. It contained all kinds of 4-footed animals, as well as reptiles and birds. Then a voice told him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." "Surely not, Lord," Peter replied. "I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." The voice spoke to him a second time. "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean." This happened 3 times, and immediately the sheet was taken back to heaven. While Peter was wondering about the meaning of the vision, the men sent by Cornelius found out where Simon's house was and stopped at the gate. They called out, asking if Simon, who was known as Peter, was staying there. While Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Simon, 3 men are looking for you. So get up and go downstairs. Do not hesitate to go with them, for I have sent them." Peter went down and said to the men, "I'm the one you're looking for. Why have you come?" The men replied, "We have come from Cornelius the centurion. He is a righteous and God-fearing man who is respected by all the Jewish people. A holy angel told him to ask you to come to his house so that he could hear what you have to say." So just as with Cornelius' vision, we ask the same questions with Peter's vision here. So the first question is where? Well, this took place on a rooftop in Joppa. Rooftops were more of what we consider a patio. They were flat, and there was a ladder or a staircase on the outside that gave access to the roof. And the roofs, they served practical purposes, such as drying vegetables. Since they were private, they were also a good place to get alone or to go and pray. They were also a great place to just go and to cool down and relax. The typical Palestinian home was really poorly ventilated, and so it was hot, it was stuffy. On the roof, a person could relax under a canopy, enjoying an afternoon breeze. So that's where Peter was, on the roof. So that leads us to the who, and the who is Peter. Peter was, as we know, a Jewish Christian, and Jewish Christians believed Jesus to be their Messiah, but they still maintained all the rituals and customs of the Jewish faith. They were Christians, but they were still Jewish. As was mentioned, there was a large Gentile population in Caesarea, but there was also a substantial Jewish minority. And so the two sides, the Gentiles and the Jews in Caesarea, didn't always get along. There was considerable friction between the Gentiles and the Jews living in the city. So it's interesting that this is the place that God wanted Peter to go. Just as there was friction in Caesarea between the Gentiles and the Jews, Peter had his own inner conflict with the Gentiles. It was not that he hated the Gentiles. It was that as a good Jewish person, he simply didn't associate with the Gentiles. But obviously, if a Jewish Christian could not associate with the Gentiles, how were the Gentiles going to learn about the love of Jesus? They couldn't. In God's timing, it was time to officially take the message to the Gentiles, and Peter was the man to do it. When did this take place? Well, this took place at noon. And Peter was on the roof to pray at noontime. The Jewish religion prescribed prayer in the morning and afternoon and evening, but not at high noon. So Peter here, by praying at noon, he was going above and beyond what was required. Noon was not a usual weekday mealtime for the Jews either. The custom was to have a light mid-morning meal and a heavier meal later in the evening. But noon was not the normal time for the Jews. It was the normal time, however, for the Romans and for some other locations, and may have been the custom in Joppa. So Peter was either going by the Roman custom, or perhaps he just skipped breakfast that morning. We don't really know. But for whatever reason, Peter, as he prayed there at noon, he became quite hungry. That leads us to the what. And the question of the what is a vision. Just like Cornelius had a vision, Peter also had a vision. Before a meeting between Cornelius and Peter could take place, Peter needed to receive this vision. Peter was a Jew. And in the New Testament times, as we said, the Jews didn't associate with the Gentiles. According to Jewish tradition, Jews were not allowed to enter a Gentile's house. They especially weren't allowed to dine with them. Well, the two things Peter was experiencing on the roof were included in this vision. First, Peter was in prayer. In prayer, he was contacting with God. And so God heightened this connection by putting Peter into a higher consciousness in which he could receive a special message from him. Peter was also hungry, and God used that hunger in the vision to teach him an important spiritual truth. And so in Peter's vision, he saw a sheet coming down from heaven. And contained in that sheet were a plethora of animals, reptiles, and birds. Some of them may have been okay to eat for food, but some were impure, according to the Jewish food laws. And Peter knew that. But then a voice told Peter, "Go for it. Have a feast. It's like an all-you-can-eat buffet." Well, Peter didn't want anything to do with it. He refused. He refused because he knew that at least some of those animals in that sheet were impure. And he said, "I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." To which the voice replied, "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean." And that scene was repeated a couple times. So all in all, Peter refused to eat the animals that were on that sheet a total of 3 times. We recall other times in Peter's life when he dug in his heels and refused to submit to God's will. The first time is when Jesus explained to the disciples that he must suffer and die, but would be raised on the 3rd day. And Peter took Jesus aside, and he said to Jesus, "Never, Lord, this shall never happen to you." The second occurrence was when Jesus took a basin of water and a towel, and he was going from disciple to disciple, washing the disciples' feet, the role of a servant. And when Jesus came to Peter, Peter said, "No, you shall never wash my feet." And now, as God directs Peter to eat the animals that are contained in this sheet, Peter refuses. In all those instances, Peter felt that he was in the right. Of course, he did not want to see Jesus suffer and die. He'd protect him at all costs. And of course, Peter didn't want Jesus to wash his feet. After all, Jesus was his master, not his servant. And of course, Peter didn't want to eat these impure animals because that would go against God's laws. But in each instance, Peter is being challenged to open his heart and mind to a new spiritual truth. In the case of the animals in the sheet, God was opening Peter's mind that the Gentiles were welcome to be included in the family of believers. The Gentiles were just as legitimate as Jews to be part of the family of God. The distinction between clean and unclean foods was a major problem in that day between the Jews and the Gentiles. So when the voice told Peter, "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean," he was referring to a statement that Jesus had earlier made, because Jesus once taught, "Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them." So according to Jesus, it's not what you eat that defiles you. It's what comes out of you. It's evil thoughts and desires and words and actions, all the sin and evil stuff. Those are the things that contaminate a person. So according to Jesus, all food is declared clean. That's not what contaminates you at all. So God has lifted the distinction between clean and unclean foods, a boundary that separated the Jews and the Gentiles. So Gentiles were welcome to become Christians without first having to become Jews and adhere to all those Jewish food laws. And Jews and Gentiles could fellowship together without having to worry about what was going to be served for dinner. Well, just as the vision ended, the men sent by Cornelius dropped by the house looking for a man named Peter. And they came, of course, at the very perfect time because God was orchestrating all of this. The Holy Spirit told Peter that some men were looking for them and that he should go with them. So Peter went downstairs and said, "I'm the one you're looking for. Why have you come?" The men replied that an angel told Cornelius to ask Peter to come to his house so that Cornelius could hear what Peter had to say. And Peter realized all of this was from God. He was to go to Cornelius, a Gentile, to share Jesus with him. Jesus had earlier given Peter the keys to the kingdom, and Peter had used those keys. First, he used those keys to open up Christ's kingdom to the Jews in Jerusalem. In a second, he used those keys to open up Christ's kingdom to the Samaritans when he visited the people that Philip had baptized there in Samaria. And now, he's going to use those keys to the kingdom again to go to Cornelius and to open up Christ's kingdom to the Gentiles. Before ascending, Jesus said, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." And we can see this very thing happening as Christ's message of love and forgiveness is being spread now to all the nations. After Peter's vision, he opened up his heart to spread the gospel and fellowship with people who weren't like him. And we can learn from Peter's vision that Christ's love and forgiveness is available to all people, regardless of who they are or regardless of where they came from. And we need to open our hearts to share the gospel with all people, not just people like us. We're not members of Christ's country club. We are members of Christ's church, and it's open to all people who would put their faith and trust in him.